Worley, and along with my wife Glenda, we have spent nearly 50 years in ministry in Ethiopia, Norway, the UK, and in the US. I'd like in these podcasts to share with you some of our experiences from those years. When was the last time you had a flat tire? Being able to change a tire has often been an indication that you could drive and could handle a car. My little Dodge Dart doesn't even have a spare tire, just a pump to inflate it. What if you had to drive nearly 800 miles without a jack in your car? That was my experience shortly after arriving in Ethiopia in 1968. Fellow missionary Jerry Piercy had lived and worked in Asmara, Eritrea, but was relocating to Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He'd already moved his family and household goods to Addis, but had to leave his car in a garage in Asmara for repairs. He asked me if I wanted to fly with him to Asmara and drive back to Addis. Having just arrived in the country, it seemed like a great way to see the country. The flight to Asmara was uneventful, but the 763 miles drive back to Addis on gravel, and sometimes no gravel roads, was an experience that 50 years later is well stored in my memory bank. That first morning started out well. We left Asmara early in the day with food, water, and some jerry cans filled with fuel. We didn't expect to find any restaurants, hotels, or service stations along the way. We did see little shepherd boys tending to their animals, as well as men and women with their donkeys loaded with grain going or coming from the market. We also passed some men leading their camels, which were loaded with goods they had bought at the market. You could almost begin singing, "Oh, what a beautiful morning. Oh, what a beautiful day." But suddenly, that all changed when we had our first flat tire. Well, that's not a problem. We're certainly capable of changing a tire until we discovered we did not have a jack or tools to change the tire. This certainly created a problem. We can't ask the camel driver to loan us his jack when he didn't have one. Why in the world would you take off on a trip like this without a jack to change tires? It was then Jerry realized that somebody at the garage needed a jack and took it. In other words, they stole it. We were out in the middle of nowhere on the first leg of that long journey to Addis Ababa. While standing there on the side of the road, scratching our heads, wondering what we were going to do, all of a sudden, what should appear but a road scraper? That in itself seemed like a miracle, because it didn't seem like the roads had ever been scraped. But God sent his angels on a road scraper, and they were able to help us get the tire changed so we could continue our journey. Memory fails me as to how many flat tires we had that day, but each time God sent his angel to help us with our need. We traveled all day trying to reach the mission station at Kombolcha, which is a halfway point between Asmara and Addis Ababa. There we would be able to stay in the mission house, get a shower, and sleep in a comfortable bed. Kombolcha lies in a valley, and in order to get there, you cross some very high mountains and steep ravines. It was late at night, and as we rounded one of those sharp curves, the car went thump, thump, thump. Guess what? We had another flat tire. It is dark and it is raining. What are we going to do? Suddenly, God sent an angel in the disguise of a policeman. I have no idea what the policeman was doing driving up the mountain at that time of the night. But as far as we were concerned, God sent him to help us. We finally reached the mission station and got a good night's rest. The next morning, we got the tire patched and continued our journey. There was still a long trip ahead of us on unpaved roads. From Kombolcha, it was a 3 to 4 hour drive to Roby, where there was another mission station. In recent years, the road had been paved, but in those days it wasn't, and it was a hot, dusty ride. You had to be on the lookout for animals and people. Their attitude was that they were there before the automobile and had more right to the road than those who were driving. It was and still is a rule that if you hit an animal or a person, whether it was your fault or not, you're responsible to compensate. If the person died, then it was much more complicated and expensive. Roby lies in a lower elevation than Kombolcha, and it gets quite hot. My memory of one of the many flat tires we had on that trip was in Roby. We were near the dry riverbed that runs through the town, and as I recall, we had to go out into the riverbed to find rocks and something to lift the car with. As you know, necessity is the mother of invention, and as far as this trip was concerned, we had to be creative. The early missionaries lived in a small pioneer house called PU huts until they could build a house. Life was not easy for those early missionaries. There were many adjustments they had to make. They not only had to adjust to living conditions in a very hot region, but if they had children, they also had to make the adjustment of being separated from their children who were in boarding school in Addis. From Roby, there was a steady climb in elevation as we continued our drive to Addis. Driving from the desert region of Roby to Debreceni is about a 45-minute drive, but it is a much cooler place. The highlight of any trip from Addis to Dessie is to stop at Needle's Eye. This is a place through the mountains which has a V-shaped opening where you can get a great view of the lowlands below. You will also get to enjoy watching the many baboons scrabbling around on the sides of the cliff, and it'll not be long before the children come selling their goods. One of those items is a round wool knitted hat that is easy to sell to tourists who often are willing to pay far more than it is worth. They also sell oregano, which is used in much of their food. When we got to Debre Berhan, we were finally over the mountains, and from there it is about a 3-hour drive to Addis. Needless to say, we were glad to get back to our families. It was, however, a great introduction to the ministry we would have. The government had given our mission permission to start schools and mission stations all along that same road that we had traveled. There was an estimated 10 to 12 million people composed of many different tribal and ethnic groups. The majority were Muslim and were primarily illiterate, thus the need for education. However, we knew that by teaching them to read, they would be able to read the Bible, and this was our goal. The psalmist said, "The entrance of thy word giveth light. It giveth understanding to the simple." The gospel has always brought light. In fact, Jesus' ministry in Galilee was prophesied by Isaiah. The people which sat in darkness saw great light. And to them which sat in the region and shadow of death, light is sprung up. Let me encourage you to pray for those areas of the world that still do not have the light of the gospel. My next podcast will continue with stories about our early days in Ethiopia. Please share these podcasts with others.